Begin. My name's Bruno Waterfield. I'm Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, so I come across this discussion a lot. And in fact, one of the worst terms of abuse you could be called in Brussels is populist. Whenever you ask a really unpopular question in a press conference, and you can always guarantee that some urbane fonctionnaire will sidle past you in French, German, Swedish, Danish, whatever accent, hiss into your ear, you're nothing but a populist. So the issue of populism is one that gets people very agitated, so it'd be very useful to use this discussion to unpick it. Is populism the threat that many people regard it as? Could it represent an opportunity in terms of breaking up some of the old certainties of politics? What is absolutely certain about populism is the scare to hell out of a lot of people in power. So it's obviously useful to debate to have. I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order that they're speaking. I'm going to just give you the one-liners that are in the book. We don't actually have much time. First of all will be Jamie Bartlett, Head of Violence and Extremism Programme Demos, author Under the Influence, What We Know About Binge-Drinking, and Inside the English Defence League. After Jamie, we're going to have Michał Sutowski, a political scientist and columnist for Krytyka Polityczna, Poland. Very interesting publication from Angus. After Michał, we're going to have Ferenc, who's the Associate Professor at the Institute for Art Theory and Media Studies in Budapest. And then, last but not least, Mick Hume, Editor at Large, Spiked and Writer at the Times. Jamie, please. Can I just say that all the speakers are going to speak for 5 minutes. That's what they get. When we take questions and points from the floor, you will all get a minute and a half. So we can get plenty of debate going, so you have a chance to come back again if necessary. Coming back again is sometimes as useful as standing up in the first place, and I'll hold people to time so we get plenty of chance to have a good debate.
Thank you very much. Doing a paper on the English Defence League and binge drinking was a complete coincidence and honestly nothing to do with that. And in actual fact, the paper on the English Defence League is going to be available probably in the next 30 minutes or so, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So what is populism? Well, the one that I've done, it's such a bizarre mix at the moment, and it's really changing quite quickly, and that's what makes it very difficult to both define, but also to understand in respect of how serious the problem is. It seems to be some kind of combination of a conservative-ish right-wing critique of immigration, a lack of integration, a critique of multiculturalism, but that's often now increasingly combined with rather socialist left-wing critiques of globalisation and the Europe and open markets. Mixed into that is everyone's obvious favourite of anti-establishment populism. You know, these liberal elites have no idea what really happens in the real world, they're out of touch. When you put those three things together, it's an extremely powerful combination. And the problem that I have with it is that some people are genuinely, I suppose, genuine about that critique. They're not fascists, they're not extremists, they feel they've got something important to say, but everyone keeps calling them extremists, but others are using it as a cloak for something that's far more sinister. And it's extremely difficult to know who's doing what. Of course, what makes this even more complicated, I think, is the way that over the last 5 years in particular, and whether you're looking at the Danish People's Party, maybe the Norwegian Progress Party, but to a lesser extent, certainly the change in the Front National and the Marine Le Pen. It's shifting from the traditional right-wing concerns, extreme right-wing concerns of race, and it's about values. It's about defending European Enlightenment values of liberalism, of equality from the horrors of Sharia law or whatever else they're so worried about. Of course, the threat is massively exaggerated, but it's difficult for those with a liberal or progressive persuasion to disagree with some of those points. So it's growing dramatically, we all know that. whether you look over the last 5 years, both electorally it's growing from the Jobbik movement, I think it's mentioned in the pamphlet, to the True Finns. The English Defence League, frankly, aren't as big as people think they are, and the British National Party is, of course, imploding, so we're actually bucking the trend quite well here in the UK, something I think ought to be remembered. But in addition to the political success, is a street-based success. The English Defence League might be the newest version, but Casa Pound in Italy is growing in popularity, the Blocchi d'Inghilterra is growing in popularity, and these are appealing to a new generation of younger activists who tend to be more concerned about immigration actually than their parents or their grandparents, and who have a preference for direct politics. You know, it's quite exciting when you think about setting up a street demonstration and going out there and causing havoc. It's something that obviously appeals predominantly to young men. So why is it growing? Well, partly because it is a bit of a corrective in certain places. You know, we do need to talk about some of these issues, and we've been petrified of ever bringing up the question of immigration for years, and look what happens when you don't. This is what happens. These parties become the only people that seem to be talking any sense, any common sense. They're the only people that are talking directly to people who are living in the real world. One of the best things, actually, that Tommy Robinson, the leader of the English Defence League, well, Stephen actually Danish is his real name, said to me is, none of these politicians live where I live in Luton. They don't have to live in the middle of a multicultural mess. They don't have to live with groups of gangs hanging around threatening us all the time. Now, I disagree with the tone he puts on the language, but his point is quite clear, which is that politicians are often out of touch with what ordinary people are going through, and that's something we can all agree on. The fact of the matter is, the far right, people like Geert Wilders, consistently out-debate, out-think, and out-manoeuvre our mainstream politicians, who I think are often far too soft, they're too afraid of taking these people on, and that's part of the problem. Now, my worry is, of course, things like Anders Breivik, because even when people like Marine, whether it's Marine Le Pen or Geert Wilders, denounce, as they all did, as they all came out in unison to denounce what happened, of course, even when they're denouncing it, there are always going to be people that decide that the ends that some of these populist parties are trying to achieve can only be achieved through the use of violence. And especially when, as those populist parties tend to do, speak of such urgency. You know, the fact of the matter is, according to people like Wilders, Europe is on the edge of a precipice. And we absolutely have to do something immediately, otherwise we're going to see the destruction of hundreds of years of these wonderful Enlightenment values that we've built up. Now, when you're talking that kind of extremist urgency rhetoric, then people are always going to take it a step further. And that's what really worries me. However, what I think we need to do is to cast these people as fascists, thank you, to cast these people as fascists or extremists, all of whom should not be talked to, should not be engaged with, should not be listened to, is extremely unhelpful because it just pushes them further and further away from the mainstream, makes them feel more alienated, and not only that, it makes the leaders appear to be the only ones, once again, who are talking any sense to real people. But the second concern I have is, and I'll give you a sneak preview of some of the results of both English Defence League work, but something else I've done. Now, online populism is growing dramatically. Facebook fans of these groups are far, far outnumber formal membership. And these are predominantly young, and they're motivated, and they're sharing links, and they're sharing stories, and they're generally whipping themselves up into digital apoplexy. Now, my worry is that if you don't bring those people into formal, official, offline political engagement, then they just radicalise themselves, they become more and more distant. And one quick sneak finding is that those people that we surveyed, and we've done this big survey in the English Defence League and beyond them as well across Europe, is those people who are online members of these populist groups but also get involved in offline politics are far less extreme, far more democratic, and more likely to listen about violence than those who stay only in the online world.
Thank you.
First I'd like to refer to the title of our debate itself. It's The Rise of European Populism, Revenge of Politics, with a question mark. I have a huge problem with this notion of revenge of politics, because for me, revenge, a proper revenge, means a situation in which somebody causes you some harm, and then you hit him back, and in a best situation, best option, you can regain your status, you can regain what you have lost. The minimum profit is at least some satisfaction. for that? And how does it correspond to the populism and to the people it claims to represent? Well, in my opinion, the reward or possibility of regaining the status of people that are somehow involved in populist movements is well, very weak, because all the populist movements, which can be defined as all the political forces who, on one hand, are anti-elitist and are setting in a contradiction the morally pure people, and on the other hand, demoralized elites, do not, at least in all European cases from last years, do not challenge the structural economic questions that are present in these societies, and do not challenge the class structure of the society itself. And what concerns the satisfaction? Well, in the case of one of the forms of populism in Europe, that is so-called welfare chauvinism, which pretends to exclude some part of the society of the welfare services, telling the rest of the people that it will make the chances, it will make the opportunities and chances bigger to still take advantage of it. That is, for example, excluding the ethnic minorities or the people who do not have the citizen status. Well, it gives kind of a satisfaction in a short term, also on a symbolic level, but on the cost of the most vulnerable part of the society, which I found morally disgusting and politically very dangerous. A very good example is the question of Roma, the community in France, and the way how it was treated by Nicolas Sarkozy. Of course, this is also important to mention that populism is not only the problem of very radical extreme right-wing parties, it's rather a kind of a political agenda which is influencing the mainstream, and these activity and the policies of the French government I mentioned are a good example for that. But what is, in my opinion, more important than the question raised in the written introduction to our debate, so is it a kind of so what are the most important concerns, like xenophobia, for example? In my opinion, these collateral effects of populism are going far beyond the problem of xenophobia. And well, I think that there are two scenarios in which we can imagine very dangerous collateral effects of this phenomenon in Europe. The first scenario, if European populism becomes successful, that means not exactly that some populist extreme party will take power in some important country of Europe, but it will be enough that it can introduce its agenda to the mainstream, especially in the field of anti-European discourse. That means not just opposing the immigrant minorities on the level of the nation state, but opposing also the bureaucratic elites of European Union. Of course, this effect of this could be resisting or even dismantling of any kind of institutional counterbalance against the financial elites, against the financial capital. Institutional counterbalance that could be at least potentially politically effective. I mean, the nation states and also the institutions of European Union, which logic could be, in my opinion, could be transformed into some kind of counterbalance against the financial capital. So, in such a situation, I mean, this renationalization of European politics introduced by populist forces, the subjects like True Finns or our Polish Jarosław Kaczyński would have become so-called, as Lenin would have put it, useful idiots of Deutsche Bank. Of course, the other case that they do not introduce their agenda into the mainstream, but they still exist as an important opposition, means the moralization of the political conflict, which makes it impossible to express the social and political conflict in a rational way. For example, doesn't allow. For the conclusion, I can give the example of the Polish situation. In Poland, you have a populist movement, which claims that the Germany becomes a kind of a new empire in Europe, and the problem it makes a problem for all the forces that would like to articulate some kind of a critique of German politics, but on a reasonable way. In Poland, you can be either a supporter of this theory of German empire, or just support Angela Merkel's policies on, for example, imposing austerities in private countries. Okay, so we'll continue.
Thank you. I would like to start with what Jamie just finished with. That I think if we want to do a little bit more about understanding populism than just arguing that people are wrong, principally, if they follow a populist movement, we have to understand the building blocks of what is appealing, what would be the sex appeal of this kind of movement. And I situate populism as in a somewhat broader perspective, as a worldview or as a strategy. I think populism is an inevitable condition today. It's a kind of a cultural logic in which that we may observe in every sphere of life. I will offer you a few examples to consider and to see how these various, seemingly distinct logics, cultural logics, are in a way combined together. So, for instance, some earlier forms of cultural populism were, I think, when all these procedures when the high and the low culture were converging, basically. All these moments in cultural life in the past 50 years, when previously unimaginable forms of cultural forms became mainstream behavior, like wearing blue jeans in school, for instance. I think these are the elements with which populism has started. Also, another important element, the reification of the everyday experience. The consumer is always right. The way, for instance, political communication is building on this logic. Instead of selling an ideology, they are buying an audience for their product. Also, somewhat interconnected with these two others, the appeal of the straight, plain talk, strong language in public life, as a down-to-earth, somewhat more authentic expression of reality, as a polished middle-class talk very often. Or the appearance of or the mainstreaming, getting identity politics as mainstream. Also, the appearance of single-issue politics, with all the appeals to down-to-earth examples of everyday life, risks taken from examples from people's everyday life. Also, the personalization of culture, personalization in terms of news values in the media, or personalization in terms of consumption media, the consumption of on-demand programs instead of sitting at the sofa and listening what the BBC has to tell to you this evening. Also, again, combined with the previous examples, the appearance of niche markets for devoted customers. Also, the fragmented public sphere use instead of the unified public sphere, what Cass Sunstein calls the cyber balkanization, all the forms of folksonomies in marketing, in taste, in politics, the way Amazon is selling books, for instance. And also the user-friendliness and the simplification as a norm in culture, that things should be visualized. There wouldn't be any product or story which doesn't have a picture in it. You see, again, the norm that everything should be simple. You know, if it's not simple, then it's not true. You know, so you should see the way this logic is working. So, as a consequence of it, the Great Society and the unified public sphere don't sell very well. And together with this, enlightenment in the processes of globalization appeared as something like a folkloristic opinion of local interest. And so basically, I praise populism structurally, because joining what Jamie said, because structurally it's really operating or mobilizing their everyday experience. It's like the best journalism, you know. And in a way, I would consider it as a form of self-government. But at the same time, it's very important to see that with the emergence of populism, especially in politics, the number one victim is the idea of the universal and equal human dignity. And I think this is a big problem, and we can talk about it.
Nick?
Okay, 5 minutes, so a couple of points. I'll lose all the examples for now. I want to just turn things around and talk about not the populist movements themselves, but the obsession at the top of the European government and societies with the danger of populism. Because whenever I hear somebody talk about the danger of populism, it really makes me want to reach for my gun. We can reconcile that. It is an expression, the talk of the danger of populism is to me primarily, in most circumstances, an expression of an elitist disdain for mass politics. And that's basically what it is. The problem in Europe today is not populism. The problem is the crisis of European democracy. We are faced with a continent run by increasingly isolated Euro elites who have no roots in the societies that they claim to represent, and no politics which mobilise the movements of support. And so we can see the way they have been trying to treat the economic crisis in Europe as a private affair to be dealt with through closed-door summits and no democratic discussion at all. And the way they're now proposing even more centralised powers and institutions to solve the crisis, which will take politics and government even further away from the people who will come up. And I think in that context, the one thing that the Euro elites are even more fearful of than their out-of-control finances are their uncontrollable electorates. And the European elite's obsession with populism, I think, has got to be seen in that context. As to what populism is, we see it's all very, as we've heard, it's a very confused label which can, cover a multitude of sins. It doesn't fit easily into the old left-right divides, and there's a lot of academic discussion on it. I was reminded of one definition of it, which I think is useful to raise in relation to the elite discussion, Luke concern, which is in the Cambridge Dictionary, where it defines populism as political ideas and activities that are intended to represent ordinary people's needs and wishes. We can't have that. We can't have that besmirching European projects. Politics that are intended, whether they do or not, to represent the needs and wishes of ordinary people. So 2 points. One, the panic about populism, and which is extreme in the panic about fascism being on the march in various European countries, I think expresses fundamentally the liberal elite's deep, dark fears of the public, the masses. Their fear that democracy is basically dangerous, and that this is what it leads to if we let it get out of hand. They're creating monsters of their imagination, and somehow they need to limit that threat by limiting democratic participation. And secondly, that obviously these parties are not entirely figments of their imagination, they do exist. The support these parties are winning reflects primarily popular disaffection and alienation from the political mainstream. It's not a wholehearted endorsement of any kind of specific racist, Islamophobic program that some of these tin pot parties might be putting forward. It's rather a reflection of a much wider exhaustion of mainstream politics. So that, for example, the talk about the problem of immigration, I think becomes a hook on which to hang people's wider disaffection with the state of European society and the feeling that the country is not their own anymore, etc., etc. But it's a rejection of the elite primarily that these parties' support reflects. And indeed, as has been mentioned, the elite's own disdain for the masses means they're not against a bit of what they would call, in other contexts, populism themselves. People like Sarkozy do very much seek to mobilise popular support on the basis of fears, rather than anything more substantially political than that. And all these parties are doing is really taking that to a more consistent expression as a political program. So on all sides, it seems to me that the consensus is that the masses are really the danger. And it reflects, this fear of populism reflects a contemptuous kind of dog whistle attitude to the masses, that if they hear the dog whistle of these reactionary populist parties, then the people will all rally to it, and something's got to be done. And I think we've got to question that fundamentally, because the real danger of Europe lies elsewhere. If you do want to counter these parties, by the way, the last thing to do is to talk about bans and restrictions on free speech and more anti-democratic measures, because that is only going to fuel the anger and the alienation that gives them this fall in the first place. But for me, the far bigger problem is the decline of democratic discussion in Europe in the middle of this historic crisis, and the new Euro-elitism that's being strengthened as we talk about new centralised institutions taking over the national governments and running economies and so on. And then finally, as an old man on the left, I certainly don't support any of these parties. But part of me is not unhappy to see them giving two fingers to the kind of unaccountable power that sits atop Europe today. Give me that kind of populism over the dictatorship of Euro bureaucrats and big caps in Europe.
Thank you very much. Good thank our speakers. What I'd like to do is go straight out to the audience. If you start putting up your hands. And I want you to come back on it does seem to me that a lot of the other speakers on this panel are pretty soft on populism. I mean, it seems to, kind of give a bit of support from the sidelines. Jamie, said it was a product of politicians being able to touch Ferenc, said they've created a new plain political language that is much more in touch with people's real concerns. In fact, Mick has really been kind of more negative about it. So I'd like to see hands up, please, and I'd like to see people coming back on some of these points. Right, at the back there.
One of the things that springs to my mind is I spent a lot of time in Spain in the 90s, where the idea of Europe, a wider Europe, with obvious caveats, was fairly widespreadly held within both political elites and a younger generation. And given let's put aside the idea of Europe breaking up, or the EU breaking up, or the Euro collapsing. If we are facing much closer political union, albeit bureaucratic, anti-democratic, etc., we're witnessing now the discrediting of the idea of any idea of a European aspiration, whatever shape that may be, possibly for an entire generation. And that concerns me, because I think that populism, or the alleged rise of populism, could be seen as one alternative. But I'd like the panel to give any other ideas of what could replace that as an aspiration. Because in Britain, perhaps it's not something that we have seen as something that many people are buying into. But elsewhere in Europe, that most certainly is the case. So that loss, potentially at the moment, for a generation, of the idea of something broader and beyond something at a European level, I think is quite significant.
Okay, lady here, just move up.
Oh, I hope I don't look threatening or violent, but I do have 2 shotguns. One of my father's sisters married a Jew, and my other aunt married a German, so I'm pretty well versed in the history of the Second World War. I've also read the Koran. But I was joining EDL on a protest against the construction of a local mosque. I canvassed in 4 marginals before the general election. One of those was Luton. And on the doorsteps, the top, and I can shut up and listen, the top issue was immigration, including that from the EU, and the second was the EU itself. I reported back to my MP. There were 2,000 people at the People's Pledge rally at Central Hall last weekend, which is more than the membership who actually attended any of the party political conferences, because most of the attendees there were lobbyists or journalists. Actually, both 2 EU flags last weekend, one outside Central Hall alongside the communists, and again on College Green alongside the BNP. Now, I think the politicians ought to take notice of what's happening across the political spectrum.
Thank you. And another lady here in a green top, right, just on the edge here. No, come forward a bit. Can you keep your hands up? And then... Okay.
I came to this, I suppose, with this same question. Populism. What on earth are you, well, I know what you mean by it, and you've all used the phrase, the name, without seeming to worry about it. I'm really keen on democracy. Now, what else is democracy, for instance, if it's not talking to the people? And let's just take our country. When an election comes along, and democracy, if nothing else, does imply elections, choice, all the politicians of all the parties are saying to all the people all the time, well, vote for us and you'll have this much extra benefits and that much extra in your pocket to spend. Populism at its absolute, and we think nothing wrong with that, that's democracy, we say. And now, when suddenly you're going to talk about populists, how do you define them? It's fringe, or you might have extreme groups or parties with whom you disagree. If all they're doing is talking to the people and trying to convince them of what they think, if you like, well, that's what democracy is. And the second speaker seemed to be really worried about, let them get their head. Well, they might start questioning the EU altogether. Well, we're doing that in Britain with all the mainstream parties, and it's nothing to do with populism or fringe people or extremists or anything else.
Thank you. Gentleman here at the front. And then there's another gentleman there in glasses.
That was sort of almost sad when Mr. Hume brought up exactly what I wanted to say about the definition of populism, which is exactly what he said. It's like ridiculous that it has a negative annotation to say that you're populist, because the definition is representing the majority of people. Now, I wasn't here when he talked about EDL, but I heard he talked about EDL, and I have a little short story about EDL, very quick.
Sure.
I actually met Tommy Robinson not too long ago, a month ago, and had a discussion with him, and just on their racist argument, because I am involved in a political party back home in Sweden that everybody calls racist, while they're not. And he told his story that the BNP wanted to meet with him, and because they, liked the EDL movement, the mass movement of EDL, and he met them in Luton at a bar, and he were there talking to them, and then 2 of his friends wanted to join from the EDL, and they were black. And the BNP said, well, they can't come in. We rented the bar, they can't come in. And Tommy said to them, if they can't come in here, I'm leaving right now, and if I ever see you in Luton again, there's going to be a problem. Now, this is, I think the media has a tendency to portray these so-called populist movements in whatever way they want, because the media is, in large sense, at least, maybe not so much in England, but very much so in Sweden, in cahoots, if you will, with the politicians. They're basically the same, they're driving the same agenda. So that's just one.
Thank you.
I just want to comment on what this lady in front of me said about populism, how you defend populism as a voice of the people. And I think the majority of the panel also does the same thing. You want to defend populism as a voice of the people. And I think the truth about populism lies in Mr. Michał's talk, because he actually experienced populism and what it means to have a biggest oppositional party in your parliament being populist. Because I'm from Poland as well, and I know exactly what it means, and I know that as long as it's just BNP or EDL, it's a problem of tiny groups of people, then you can say, of course, they represent the people, and it's lost touch with reality. But actually what happens when they actually get into power is that you have the same rhetoric in the mainstream politics, which means that your parliament is basically dysfunctional, I think. And that's how I feel about the Polish parliament, definitely. And I think we have recently.
Okay, I want to come back to the panel. I'm going to come back to the audience again very quickly. We all get a second chance because everyone's being very good and well behaved and not talking too long. So we have a lot of people making points about populism and the need for people to argue, and the fact that people are arguing, and those doors, those opportunities for argument shouldn't be closed. But what is it that populism does take this form that, as various people noted on the panel, seems to inflate certain harms over others? So Wilders has built a very nice political career as the third largest party, I think, in the Dutch Parliament on really blowing up and hyping the fear or the risk or the notion of harm caused to Dutch society by women covering their faces up. So it'd be interesting to talk to panelists. Why is it that they think that populism often seizes on what some people might see as less trivial aspects, and some of the points that Michał made, real structural issues in society, such as class or even nation in that sense. So Michał, do you want to give us a bit more on that, and then I'll bring up the panel then?
Yeah, because first I apologize for my bit chaotic speech. It was talking very fast, and I would like to be understood as a kind of a guy who just condemns populism and says that and uses kind of, I know, moral discourse around it. Not at all. So first, I agree there is a phenomenon like obsession with populism, which was also very easy to observe in Poland in confrontation with the Kaczynski movement. Because I personally am deeply concerned with the phenomenon of populism, but as a symptom and not as a source of the problem. It's not the Jörg Haider, who is the source of the problem. The source are the elites who do not represent the so-called mainstream elites or any kind of political elites who do not represent some group of people who has some problem. So in my opinion, well, the most two important questions that are not articulated properly and represented. One is this the situation on the labor market, and is all these things we associate with the phenomenon and the notion of precariat or precarious labor relations. The other thing is complete impotence of the politics, of the mainstream politics against the financial capitalism. So these are populism is a symptom of the situation in which mainstream politics is not able to articulate this. So I don't condemn populism as such, but I'm concerned with the situation which makes populism rise.
Yeah, you're making a point. You're making a point that why is it that the populists seem to be hitting the wrong target? There's all this stuff going on. It leaves us out of touch with society, functioning of societies, or certainly the institutions of society that are basically working on behalf of people, because you will get a chance to come back. So you made the point when you were talking about the EDL that you do have a tendency to maybe to exaggerate. Exaggerate this. All right, if you take what Michał's kind of saying, why is it that the EDL is obsessed with mosques and not, say, for example, unemployment and the decline of the car industry, which I believe used to be rather large in Luton? Why do they seize on mosques, which are after all just a building like a church?
It's very difficult.
No, I'll bring you in a second.
I think partly it's because there's such a lack of exciting ideas out there for people. And the idea for the EDL, most basically, is the notion that they're defending some greater civilization, some fantastic Western liberalism that is currently under threat. Now, it's most visibly under threat, it seems to them, from Muslims and from Islam. And I happen to know Tommy Robinson quite well and believe that in many respects he is genuine. He hasn't been media trained, so he does say things that are absolutely stupid sometimes. But oftentimes he is genuine. However, not all of them are. And you've got to bear that in mind, because he doesn't have much control over what a lot of the EDL says, what they think, and who they actually are. And some of them are far more sinister than him. Now, to me, the problem with the English Defence League is that they believe that, the Muslims are at the gates of Vienna and Western civilization is about to crumble. Now that's the sinister side of populism because that's inaccurate. But when a lot of the right-wing press seems to say that it is, and they share stories amongst themselves constantly online, which seems to support this case, they genuinely do believe it, a lot of them. And they genuinely feel that they are fighting for the very future existence of Western civilization. So I find very difficult at times to criticise them too much, except they are basing it on inaccurate information half the time. And that is part of the problem, the fragmentation of the account of immigration, the fragmentation of the account of Islam in Britain today. And that's partly actually what you were saying.
Yes, so Ferenc, I'd like to come back to that because one of the really scary populist parties that we in the media tend to wheel out every now and again is Jobbik, and of course the Guard, that apparently stands behind it. So could you tell us a little more about Jobbik and how it is that they're building quite well, they've gone down a bit in the polls, but they seem to have built quite a substantive support using this kind of plain language to explain perhaps a confusing and uncertain world to people. Can you just give us some insights into how you see their success at doing that?
Yeah. Going back shortly for your previous comments saying that we are a bit mild on populism, I think it's important to make certain distinction because I think one thing populism respects the rule of law and the constitution, and there are some other forms of populism for whom it's like it's more like a burden, in fact, to reach its goals. And Jobbik, this particular party, which is in the Hungarian parliament, and according to current polls, about the voting population, 20% of the voting population would vote for Jobbik at this moment, which would make them the second biggest party in the Hungarian parliament. And just to illustrate how nasty, to make it clear, I'm a sociologist and I work according to this very old Max Weber logic of the Verstehen, and I want to understand things, which is one thing in terms of norms, and the other thing is when, the way I personally think about Jobbik. Jobbik is a very nasty racist party, I think, and just to illustrate how they are, they are in the Hungarian parliament. They have 3 representatives, and the Western European ultra-right-wing parties don't let them join their organization because even for them, Jobbik is too racist. It's very simple. For Western European ultra-right parties, for instance, they are not flirting very obviously with anti-Semitism, for instance. For them, it's more or less still a taboo. For Jobbik, it is not. And also, Jobbik's ideas about racial profiling of communities and all sorts of populist political science fiction about how to resolve the Roma gypsy problem in Hungary. So, and answering your question, why they are successful. The reason why they are successful, because I really believe that Hungary, and in this respect, as other Eastern Central European countries share this experience, people has never had this opinion or this opportunity to really tell their minds in public life. So I think this is the first time in the history of our country when everyday people have decided that perhaps we can speak what we really think. And this is what Jobbik was capitalizing.
Mick, as you, I think you said you're an old man. Is it old man or man of the old left? I can't remember. Why is it that these populist movements definitely seem to represent a kind of disaffection and dissatisfaction in society, tend to gravitate towards their interest in Islam, for example, and not with perhaps some of those great populist kind of left-wing ideas in the past. I mean, why do you think that's happening?
Well, one reason for that is that the left have completely vacated any idea of popular or democratic politics, and what passes to the left now, it tends to be the most pro-EU, pro-bureaucratic, an outlook in life that believes that politics takes place in the European Court of Human Rights rather than on the streets or amongst the public. So they vacated a field. Now, I think your point about why they're sticking to these issues is very important, because I agree very much with Michał's expression that these are parties are a symptom of the problem. They're not the problem itself. I think it's very important to remember that. And I think it would be wrong for us to overstate the idea that these parties actually represent ordinary people. Because if you really believe that, then I've really got the same outlook as the Euro elites do. So that's what people are really like. You know, people in Europe really are scumbag, Muslim-hating racists. That's what they really are. That's why these parties really represent them. I think most voters are much smarter than that. And their preoccupation in life is not with mosques or these things. They are quite prepared to support these so-called populist parties as a gesture of their opposition to the elitism of European politics. It's basically, whatever language you want to use, is a fuck you vote, pardon my English. And that's as far as it goes. Which is why they tend to do much better in a simple yes-no situation like a referendum or a European election. It's much easier to vote against the EU, against the Euro elites. They do much better in those simple, when the whole of the referendum, when the whole of the establishment is pro the EU constitution, the populists can do very well in one vote and vote against it. In a general election where you've got to present a more rounded view of how you're going to run the economy, which has nothing to do with mosques, then they've made, in most situations, they do far as well.
Right, we'll come back out to the audience. Start putting your hands up, please. And it's just an interesting observation. I mean, Geert Wilders is possibly the most successful populist politician outside of an existing president or prime minister, such as Sarkozy and Berlusconi. Is very much a product of the establishment, the protege of Fritz Bolkestein, who was a great old man of Dutch politics. He used to be a commissioner. When Turkey was given its candidacy for EU membership, wrote a letter which he linked to every newspaper in the world, describing it as the gates of the Vienna movement. So is it perhaps a case that elites are also throwing their prejudices out there towards? So is it the case that some of these populist movements represent the popularisation of elite prejudices as well? Why is it that?
Well, Jamie said that it's the EDL maybe truly does believe that Western civilization is about to crash, or maybe it doesn't, and they're at the gates of Vienna. But actually, the people who have precipitated the collapse of Western civilization is the elite within the West. Let's remind ourselves that it's them that have argued consistently in universities for the last 15 years that the dead white males, that everything about the West is that it rapes and pillaged the world, that there's nothing to be proud and uphold about. In fact, the 20th century really represents everything that's nasty and negative and pernicious about humans. We got Dachau and the Gulag. And it strikes me that also when it comes to this whole thing about where these ideas are from, it's hardly surprising that when we get into a discussion about resources, where the dominant discussion is that there are finite resources and there's a boat, and if you have more people on the boat, it sinks, that people are concerned around numbers of people. That's not a wildly new thing. That's been a mainstream discussion for quite some time, but all of the discussions, and they take in different forms, obviously in different European nations, around identity politics and difference and fear of the other, have all been things that we can see are now used to keep people isolated and polar. Just the final point I would say is that on this, that's why in a discussion about populism, it's important, and that's why the discussion around tolerance and all of that's really important. They're not just abstract philosophical ideas, they're how we engage and begin to shed some light and win some of those arguments and some people onto some new ways of thinking about things.
Okay, could that microphone come there to the guy who's got his hand up?
Okay, just a quick question really to the whole panel. And we've talked about populism and being seen as a very negative way, reported in a very negative way, and generally seen as a bad thing. And we've also discussed the idea that populism should represent the majority of people. And then if you look at that, and then you look at the whole occupations in Wall Street and different occupations around the world that are happening at the moment, and they're supposedly represent the 99% are supposed to be sort of very populist movements, and they're getting very positive review, really, mainly in the press, very sympathetic anyway. So why do you think there is that real difference, which supposedly both are populist movements?
Okay. Anyone else wants to speak? Put their hand up. The microphone go there.
Well, I'd like to answer that last question, actually, because I think there's an element of the definition of populism that has not been explored. I mean, I think it's certainly the case that populism is attempting to represent the interests of ordinary people, but the extra aspect of it is when the interests of ordinary people are somehow being sidelined because the elites are favouring the minority. That's why populism is historically had a negative connotation. It's not just about representing ordinary people. They feel that they are being marginalised by a government or an elite favouring a minority, usually a foreign minority, and that's why populism does have its fascist connotations.
Quickly there, please.
Yes, I think we're witnessing one of the dangers of democracy, and the founding fathers of America understood this very well because they were themselves a minority that was persecuted, and that's why they gave their country the US Constitution, which defends rights. And I think just on another side point, I think no one's talked about the burqa ban in Paris, and I think that's explained in France. I think that's an important issue here.
Okay, we've run out of time. We get the panel to give us 1 minute summaries coming back. We've kind of gone full circle. We started off with, populism is because democracy isn't working very well and people need a voice and they're making themselves heard, to populism showing us the dangers of democracy. And Michał said he was worried that populism could lead to dismantling of institutions such as the European institutions. So perhaps one of the things that we could think about, even if the speakers would want to come back on something else, is do the institutions of society need to be insulated from populism and the dangers of democracy, just in case some of the kind of liberal values and mores that we've kind of got used to are dismantled or thrown away. Can I get the speakers to come back and sum up? Try and keep it to around about a minute in the order that they spoke, so starting with Jamie.
Yeah, the reason the Occupy elects people, I get a good one reason, is because they're rich, well-spoken students and the English Defence League are politicised football fans. That's, to me, rather obvious. I actually think that I agree with the gentleman at the back. They are proud, they're very proud of their country, they're very proud of their country's history and values, and they do hate the elites almost as much as they hate, in the case of the English Defence League, Islamists. But I don't think it's just a protest vote. I don't think it's just a fuck you vote. To me, there is more than that. There is a positive identification with this sense of idealism that these groups are bringing. And it's more than just being disgruntled with the out-of-touch elites, although that is important. And I think the thing that we haven't touched upon and raised it correctly, there are some populists like Geert Wilders who would deport third-generation Muslims back to their country of origin if they committed a crime. And that is not democratic, and that is the side of populism that worries me. But when they stay within the law, and when they guarantee those rights to people, then I don't have a problem with it in the same way.
Really, 1 point.
Yeah, 1 point. Okay, so the skill was very crucial, I think. From my point of view, the EU is a political institution, and that means that it has at least some potential to be transformed towards the interest of the people. Wall Street as itself doesn't have such a potential, and in my opinion about the relation between society and the populism, could populism be a positive phenomenon? I think it can be expressed in an anecdote about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which I'm not sure if it's true, but I like it very much. It's that in the early 30s, as the delegation of trade unionists came to FDR and proposed him, kind of a set of reforms, which we could call Keynesian or something like that, to answer that, sounds great, good idea, but now you have to get out of the streets and enforce me to do that. So this is a kind of a logic in which populism could work in a good way.
Ferenc, please. 1 point.
I think two fronts should be opened with regards to populism. One is protecting the constitution and the rule of law. I think politics and the elites and culture should be very clear about it. The second would be just opening another one, which would be using the terms of populism. And at the same time, I would argue that this plain language, down-to-earth language is really something that can be very effective. And never forget that the most successful product of the unified European project is the Champions League.
Okay, Bruno said, do we need more insulation? Insulation is very popular in this eco-friendly age. I think it's the last thing we need. Too much insulation of European institutions from the influence of people, from the courts to the banks at the moment. I would like to see a democratic revolution in Europe. That's why I think the argument has to come forward is not for some kind of regression to nationalism, because that's not going to happen anyway. The whole point about the EU is built on the failure of nationalism in Europe. But the position we put forward on spike for the last few years is one of being pro-Europe and against the EU. I think the problem is that's been, those two things have been confused too often. The EU as an institution is the most anti-democratic, conservative, stultifying body on the face of the earth. In order to have a Europe, a democratic Europe that's worth being a member of and calling yourself a European, I think we need to tear down all the insulation that's protected the Euro age.
Don't you think Goldman Sachs is worse?
No. Can we thank our speakers for acting?